Let's get one thing straight. I moved to the suburbs for the silence. I had this romantic, idiotic notion of a life filled with the gentle hum of lawnmowers on a distant Saturday morning, the cheerful chirping of birds that weren't pigeons fighting over a discarded hot dog, and the profound, soul-affirming quiet that allows a man to hear his own cholesterol hardening. I am, by trade and by temperament, a creature of the indoors. A digital hermit. My official title is UI/UX designer, which is a fancy way of saying I spend 10 hours a day arguing with project managers about the optimal placement of a button on a screen. My natural habitat is a climate-controlled room with a high-speed internet connection and a chair that costs more than my first car. So I traded my cramped, perpetually noisy apartment in the city, a place where my upstairs neighbor was a professional clog dancer and my downstairs neighbor was learning the bagpipes, for a slice of the American dream in Harmony Creek. Harmony Creek. The name itself is a lie. It's not harmony. It's a hostage situation dictated by the color beige. Every house is a variation on a theme of taupe, ecru, and gentle fawn. The mailboxes are identical. The lawn heights are regulated to the millimeter. There's a 30-page document outlining acceptable breeds of decorative shrubbery. It was perfect. It was the quietest, most boring place on earth. A sensory deprivation tank with a 2-car garage. My quest, I thought, was complete. My house, number 112 Snapdragon Lane, was my fortress of solitude. It was also my laboratory. I'm a technophile, a gadget freak. Some men buy sports cars or take up woodworking. I install smart home features that are probably listening to my deepest, darkest secrets. My refrigerator analyzes its contents and texts me passive-aggressive reminders that the kale is wilting. My sound system can replicate the acoustics of the Sydney Opera House, a feature I primarily use to listen to podcasts about unsolved murders. And my latest acquisition, the new love of my life, was a set of 4 state-of-the-art, ultra-discreet, 4K security cameras. Oh, they were beautiful. Sleek, minimalist pods of polished black aluminum. They blended seamlessly into the beige architecture. They had night vision that could spot a field mouse twitching at 50 yards, motion detection powered by a sophisticated AI, and a companion app so intuitive it made me weep with professional jealousy. I didn't install them out of fear. Harmony Creek's most significant crime wave in the last decade involved a teenager who borrowed his neighbor's prize-winning flamingo lawn ornament for a prank. No, I installed them for the same reason a man climbs a mountain, because I could. And because I genuinely wanted to know if it was a squirrel or a chipmunk that was stealing the Amazon packages I occasionally left out for more than 5 minutes. I craved data. I wanted a 24-hour, high-definition live stream of my own personal beige kingdom. It gave me a sense of order, a sense of control, a sense that within the 60-foot by 100-foot confines of my property, I was king. For 3 glorious weeks it was everything I'd dreamed of. The footage was breathtakingly mundane. I watched a mailman sigh heavily. I watched a leaf fall from a tree in stunning, cinematic slow motion. I watched a beagle from 2 doors down conduct a thorough and lengthy investigation of my recycling bin. It was my own personal nature documentary, and I was its David Attenborough, providing hushed, reverent narration from the comfort of my ergonomic throne. And here we see the majestic Amazon Prime delivery van, I'd whisper to myself, making its twice-daily migration to the front porch, a truly magnificent creature. This, I believed, was peace. This was serenity. This was the pinnacle of human achievement. I was so wrong. It was a Tuesday, 10:14 a.m. The sun was shining. The birds were chirping non-threateningly. I was deep in the zone, wrestling with a particularly stubborn piece of code that refused to cooperate. My coffee, a single-origin Ethiopian blend that I'd brewed using a method involving a gooseneck kettle and a digital scale, was at the perfect sipping temperature. The universe, for all intents and purposes, was aligned. Then my phone buzzed. A notification. I glanced at it, expecting an email from a client with another round of minor tweaks that would inevitably derail my entire day. But it wasn't an email. It was from the security app. Alert, camera 1, front porch is offline. I frowned. A Wi-Fi glitch, maybe? My mesh network was a thing of beauty, a web of interconnected nodes that blanketed my property in glorious, high-speed internet. An outage was unlikely, but possible. I was about to open the app to troubleshoot when my phone buzzed again. Alert, camera 2 driveway is offline. Okay, that was weird. A cold, prickling sensation started at the base of my neck. 2 cameras down simultaneously? That wasn't a glitch. That was an event. Before my brain could fully process the implication, my phone began to vibrate uncontrollably, a frantic, buzzing death rattle on my desk. Alert, camera 3, side gate, is offline. Alert, camera 4, backyard is offline. My heart hammered against my ribs. My serene, data-rich kingdom had gone dark. This was an attack, an invasion. I lunged from my chair and scrambled to the front window. My carefully cultivated Zen state shattered into a million angry pieces. I peered through the slats of my custom-fit plantation shutters, my eyes scanning the tranquil street for... what? A van full of cat burglars, a team of industrial spies. And then I saw her. And the reality was so much worse. Her name was Brenda. Brenda was the president, CEO, and supreme overlord of the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association. She was a woman in her late 50s who looked like she was assembled in a factory that only produces disapproving tennis coaches. Her blonde hair was a masterpiece of aerodynamic engineering, a helmet of perfectly coiffed aggression. She was clad head to toe in Lululemon, an outfit that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment and had clearly never been used for any activity more strenuous than pointing out a weed. Her face was a mask of grim determination, her jaw set, her eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated righteousness. And in her right hand, she wielded a pair of gleaming, razor-sharp garden shears. I watched, paralyzed by a mixture of horror and disbelief, as she approached my house. She moved with the purposeful stride of a predator. She located the thin black wire leading from my 4th camera, the one guarding my perfectly manicured and HOA-compliant backyard, and held it up like a captured snake. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she snipped it. Snip. The sound was faint, but in the sudden silence of my world, it echoed like a gunshot. She didn't just cut the wire, she performed a little flourish, a tiny triumphant pirouette of the shears, as if she were a concert violinist playing her final, dramatic note. She picked up the now lifeless camera, its lens staring blankly up at the sky like a dead eye. She dropped it, without ceremony, into a large canvas tote bag. Emblazoned on the side of the bag, in cheerful, looping script, were the words, HOA, maintaining decorum. She then adjusted the white visor that was perched on her helmet of hair and began to power walk away, her mission accomplished, leaving a trail of violated property and my shattered dreams in her wake. My brain rebooted. The initial shock gave way to a wave of incandescent rage so pure it felt holy. This was a declaration of war. My castle had been breached. My technology had been murdered. I was going to find pants. I was going to find shoes. And I was going to unleash a torrent of righteous fury upon this scissor-wielding menace that would make the old gods weep. The bylaws, I screamed internally, could not protect her from the wrath of a deeply inconvenienced tech nerd. The confrontation played out in my mind in glorious detail. The waving of the severed wires, the sputtering indignation, the powerful, booming invocation of my sacred property rights. It was going to be epic. I was halfway to my bedroom, a man on a mission, a warrior in search of appropriate battle trousers, when I heard a sound. It was a sound that did not, under any circumstances, belong in Harmony Creek. It was the sharp, protesting screech of tires on asphalt, not the gentle, apologetic squeak of a minivan pulling into a driveway too quickly. No, this was a professional-grade Hollywood blockbuster screech. The kind of sound a car makes when it's trying to avoid a fruit stand in a high-speed chase. I froze. One foot in the hallway, one still in the living room. My planned tirade against Brenda, a magnificent, multi-act play of suburban outrage, evaporated from my mind. I crept back to the window, my heart now thumping for an entirely different reason. And there they were. Two of them, parked directly in front of my house. Black Ford Transit vans, the kind with no windows, the kind that are so obviously, aggressively unmarked that they might as well have a giant neon sign on the roof flashing government surveillance. They were a cliché made real, a physical manifestation of paranoia that had just pulled up to my curb and killed the engine. Before the vans had even finished rocking on their suspension, the side doors slid open, silently, ominously, and men began to spill out. 4 of them. They weren't wearing uniforms. They were wearing dark, ill-fitting suits, the kind of off-the-rack polyester blend that screams, "I have a thankless government job and a crushing sense of existential dread." They had the coiled wires of earpieces snaking into their ears. They had the grim, humorless expressions of men who are not here to compliment you on your choice of azaleas. The entire street, a meticulously curated diorama of suburban tranquility just moments before, was now the set of a political thriller. My neighbor across the street, Mr. Henderson, was frozen mid-stride, his garden hose dangling limply from his hand, his mouth agape. A woman jogging by slowed to a confused walk, then thought better of it and picked up her pace, fleeing the scene. My rage at Brenda was gone, replaced by a cold, liquid dread that filled my stomach and rose up into my throat. This was not about security cameras anymore. This was not about HOA bylaws. This was something else entirely. I stared, sweatpantsless and utterly bewildered, as the 4 suits began to march in perfect formation up my driveway, towards my front door. My mind, a frantic, screaming hamster on a wheel, began to cycle through every single illegal thing I had ever done in my entire life. Did I file my taxes correctly last year? Did I accidentally download a pirated movie in college? Was it that one episode of Game of Thrones back in 2017? They can't still be mad about that, can they? The logic center of my brain had shut down, leaving only the primal fear of a man who is about to have a very, very bad day. The doorbell was going to ring, and I had no idea what I was going to say. And more importantly, I still wasn't wearing any pants. I found pants. They were a pair of gray sweatpants with a mysterious stain on the knee that might have been coffee or possibly soy sauce. There was no time for forensic analysis. A hard, decisive knock echoed through the house. It was the kind of knock that doesn't ask, it demands. I took a deep breath, pulled the door open, and was greeted by the 2 lead suits. The one on the left was older, with a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of granite and left out in the rain. His expression was a permanent state of weary disappointment. The man next to him was younger, sharper, with a tailored suit that actually fit, and a flicker of something that looked suspiciously like amusement in his eyes. "Sir, are you the resident of this property?" The older one grunted. His voice was pure gravel. "Let's call him Agent Miller." "That depends," I said, my voice coming out a little squeakier than I'd intended. I cleared my throat. Are you here to serve me papers for an overdue library book from 1998? Because I have a very compelling story about a family vacation and a mischievous beagle. Miller's face didn't move. Not a single muscle. The younger one, who I mentally christened Agent Diaz, coughed to cover a laugh. Before Miller could deliver whatever soul-crushing response he was formulating, a new player entered the arena. "Officers, thank goodness you're here!" It was Brenda. She marched up the driveway, her posture radiating self-importance. She was holding her canvas tote bag like a holy relic, and in her other hand, she now brandished a laminated, spiral-bound copy of the HOA bylaws. She wedged herself between me and the agents, creating an impenetrable wall of suburban tyranny. "This man," she declared, pointing an accusatory finger at my chest, "is in direct and flagrant violation of HOA Bylaw 74C, subsection B. No unauthorized external modifications visible from the street. I've documented the entire incident. The evidence is in the bag." She puffed out her chest, clearly expecting them to slap a pair of handcuffs on me and thank her for her heroic service to the community. Miller and Diaz exchanged a look. It was a fleeting glance, but it contained volumes. It said this was not in the briefing. It said, "Who is this crazy lady?" And most alarmingly, it said, "Our entire operation is about to be derailed by a dispute over lawn ornaments." Miller turned his disappointed gaze back to me, completely ignoring Brenda as if she were nothing more than a noisy garden gnome. "Sir, we're with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to review the footage from your security cameras from the last 24 hours. It's a matter of national security." The words national security hung in the air, thick and heavy. For a second, there was silence. Then, all three of us spoke at once, a cacophony of insanity on my front porch. "Ask her," I yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Brenda. "She just murdered them, in cold blood, with gardening shears." "I was enforcing a legally binding covenant," Brenda shrieked, waving her laminated rule book like a weapon. "National security begins with maintaining property values. It's a slippery slope. First, it's unapproved cameras. Next thing you know, people are painting their mailboxes chartreuse." "Sir, we need the footage," Miller repeated, his voice dangerously calm. "It's gone," I wailed. "The cameras, the wires, the data, it's all in her bag of decorum." Miller's face, which I had thought incapable of further disappointment, somehow managed to sink another level. Diaz closed his eyes for a moment, as if praying for a sinkhole to open up and swallow him whole. Their perfectly planned, federally funded operation had just been thwarted by a woman in a visor. "Sir," Diaz said, stepping forward, "let me be clear, we weren't watching you." His eyes flicked across the street, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. "Your cameras had the perfect, unobstructed view of the house directly opposite, number 113. I followed his gaze. Number 113. Mrs. Higgins's house. Mrs. Higgins. A sweet, frail-looking woman of about 85. The neighborhood's resident grandmother figure. She brought new arrivals a welcome basket of oatmeal raisin cookies. She spent her days tending to her prize-winning roses. The most dangerous thing about Mrs. Higgins was her tendency to overwater her petunias. The idea was so profoundly, breathtakingly absurd that both Brenda and I were shocked into a momentary, stunned silence. The FBI was conducting a national security investigation into an octogenarian baker of cookies, and I, through a combination of my own tech nerd hubris and Brenda's reign of terror, had just accidentally destroyed their only lead. My day had officially gone from bad to surreal. "Our position is compromised," Miller grunted, speaking into his wrist like a character from a spy movie. He scanned the street. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, was now pretending to be deeply engrossed in examining a dandelion, but his ears were practically swiveling on his head. The jogging woman had circled the block, and was now blatantly staring from a safe distance. "The vans are blown. We need a new OP. Stationary. Immediately." His eyes, cold and calculating, drifted from the street, up the beige siding of my house, and settled on the second-story window. "My guest room." "Oh, no. Look," I started, trying to sound firm and in control. "I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. I'm happy to help, really, but my house it's a very private space. I have a very strict feng shui situation." Miller wasn't listening. He was already walking past me, into my foyer. Diaz followed, giving me a sympathetic shrug that said, "Sorry, man, that's just how the grumpy G-man rolls." "Sir," Miller said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "we can do this one of two ways. The easy way is you let us use your guest room for a few days. The hard way involves us getting a federal warrant, cordoning off your entire street, and having a team of agents in hazmat suits go through your sock drawer. We find that the hard way tends to attract a lot more attention from the neighborhood watch." He glanced pointedly at Brenda, who was still standing on my porch, looking utterly bewildered. I was defeated. A flock of angry geese could have invaded my home at that point, and I probably would have offered them coffee. I was no match for the full bureaucratic weight of the United States government. "The guest room is upstairs," I mumbled, my voice heavy with the taste of surrender. "First door on the right. There are clean towels in the closet." I found myself giving a tour of my own home to two federal agents. My carefully curated sanctuary was now an active crime scene, or a pre-crime scene, or whatever you call it when the FBI sets up shop in your house to spy on a nice old lady. They made themselves at home with an unnerving speed. They commandeered my favorite reading chair, positioning it by the window. They unspooled wires and plugged strange black boxes into my walls. Diaz, with the apologetic air of a man asking for a favor he knows is an imposition, turned to me. "Hey man, sorry to ask, but what's the Wi-Fi password?" "It's leave me alone 123 K," I said deadpan. Diaz typed it in. "With a capital L?" "And a capital M and a capital A," I sighed. "It's a plea for help." My quiet suburban life was over. I was now the unwilling proprietor of the FBI and Breakfast, a charming little establishment offering stunning views of a potential national security threat and all the artisanal coffee two grumpy agents could drink. I retreated to my office and sat in my expensive chair, staring at a screen full of code that now seemed utterly meaningless. Upstairs, I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of my government at work. My dream of silence was dead, and I had a sinking feeling it was about to get a whole lot louder. The days that followed blurred into a surreal, paranoid routine. I learned to tiptoe around my own house. I developed a sixth sense for when Agent Miller needed a coffee refill, an event he signaled with a series of deep, world-weary sighs. Agent Diaz, at least, was conversational. He'd occasionally offer commentary on the riveting action across the street. "Ooh, she's watering the hydrangeas," he'd report, with the gravity of a sportscaster calling the final play of the Super Bowl. "Looks like she's using the mist setting today. Bold choice." I grabbed the local yellow pages, or rather, I Googled "contractors near me" and called the first company with a 5-star rating and a name that inspired confidence. Sal's Fix It All. Sal arrived the next day. He was a man who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts found on a construction site. He was short, built like a fire hydrant, with a thick neck and hands the size of dinner plates. He wore a dusty t-shirt that said, "I can fix it, but I'm gonna complain the whole time," a pair of paint-splattered jeans, and a look on his face that suggested he'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by any of it. He had a Brooklyn accent so thick you could spread it on a bagel. I led him down to the basement, trying to figure out how to explain my sudden, desperate need for a soundproof room without revealing that I was harboring federal agents. "So, Sal," I began, gesturing vaguely at the empty concrete space. "I'm looking to finish this area, turn it into an office. But the key thing, the absolute most important thing, is that it needs to be completely, totally, 100% soundproofed." Sal grunted, kicking at a loose piece of concrete. "Soundproofed like, I don't want to hear the kids upstairs, or soundproofed like, I'm a professional poker player and my rivals are trying to listen to my tells through the floorboards?" "More the second one," I said, trying to sound casual. "I have guests upstairs. They're, professional bird watchers. Very intense. Ornithologists. From, a university. They require absolute clinical silence for their research." Sal stopped kicking the concrete. He turned and looked at me. His eyes, small and dark, seemed to peer directly into my soul and see all the lies I was telling. He then glanced up at the ceiling, in the general direction of the guest room. "Birdwatchers," he said, his voice completely deadpan. "Right. The kind of birdwatchers that drive black windowless vans and stare at the old lady's house all day, sure." He looked back at me. "So, you want I should use the regular soundproof drywall, or the My Cousin Vinny is in the Witness Protection Program stuff? 'Cause that costs extra." I stared at him, my carefully constructed lie crumbling into dust. The man was a lie detector in a dusty t-shirt. There was no fooling Sal. A wave of relief washed over me. I didn't have to pretend anymore. "Vinny," I said, a grin spreading across my face for the first time in days. "Let's go with the Cousin Vinny package, whatever it takes." Sal nodded, a faint hint of a smile touching his lips. "All right then, let's build you a bunker." A strange sense of camaraderie formed between us in that damp, dusty basement. He was blunt, cynical, and offered terrible, often hilarious advice. But he was real. In a house that had become a stage for a surreal play, Sal was the only other person who seemed to know we were all just actors. And he was going to make sure my part of the set was built to last. Brenda was not a woman who handled being dismissed well. The FBI had ignored her authority. I was harboring mysterious, non-compliant bird watchers. The delicate beige order of Harmony Creek had been disrupted, and she was going to restore it. She launched a counter-operation. An email went out to the entire neighborhood with the subject line, "Urgent. Reactivation of the Harmony Creek Neighborhood Watch." Within hours, she had deputized a small but terrifyingly enthusiastic army of retirees. Their mission? To monitor the suspicious activities at 112 Snapdragon Lane. My house. My life descended into a full-blown spy farce. The street became a theater of the absurd, a battleground between a federal intelligence agency and a heavily caffeinated homeowners association. It started with the patrols. Brenda and her second-in-command, a wiry, nervous man named Stan, began conducting perimeter checks of my property. They wore matching neon yellow reflective vests and communicated via crackly walkie-talkies they'd probably bought at Radio Shack in 1992. "Eagle Eye, this is Command Post." Brenda's voice would squawk from behind my azalea bushes. "What's your status? Over." "Command Post, this is Eagle Eye," Stan would whisper back from his hiding spot behind the Henderson's oversized ceramic frog. "Subject has just received a package. Appears to be from Zappos. Could be coded footwear." Over. The surveillance escalated. One afternoon, Agent Diaz, who had developed a fondness for a local deli, was waiting on the porch for his lunch delivery. Stan, armed with a high-powered bird-watching telescope, was reporting on the event in real time. Diaz's earpiece, which he'd cleverly programmed to monitor the neighborhood watch frequency for his own amusement, fed him the play-by-play. "Subject is pacing," Stan reported, his voice filled with hushed excitement. Appears agitated. A vehicle is approaching. It's a civilian car. A man is exiting with a small paper bag. The exchange is being made. Subject is having pastrami on rye. Repeat, pastrami on rye. Seems spicy. Over? Diaz had to turn away and pretend to cough to hide his laughter. Brenda, meanwhile, began a campaign of psychological warfare. Every morning I would find a new official HOA violation notice taped to my door. Violation: unregistered long-term guests. Violation: excessive window staring. Violation: suspiciously high coffee consumption, potentially indicating an unlicensed bed and breakfast operation. Each one came with a threat of a fine, which she clearly had no authority to levy, but it was the principle of the thing. I was forced to become a double agent, a beleaguered diplomat shuttling between two heavily armed, paranoid factions. The low point came when Brenda cornered me on my front lawn while I was taking out the trash. "Alex," she said, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. "I want to know what's going on. Who are those men in your house?" I had to think fast. My brain, now accustomed to operating in a state of high-alert absurdity, latched onto the most ridiculous explanation it could conjure. "Brenda," I said, my voice low and serious. They're feng shui consultants, very renowned, from Tibet." Brenda squinted. "Feng shui?" "Yes," I pressed on, warming to my theme. "After the traumatic camera incident, the entire energy, the chi of my home was thrown into disarray. They're here to realign my Bagua map. The window staring is crucial. They're observing the flow of energy from Mrs. Higgins's house. Apparently, her rose bushes have an incredibly powerful and potentially disruptive aura." Brenda stared at me for a long, silent moment. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to find the specific bylaw that covered unapproved spiritual realignments. She finally made a note on her clipboard. "I'm going to have to check the regulations on that," she said, her voice laced with suspicion, and marched away. I went back inside, my head throbbing. My life was a lie, wrapped in an enigma wrapped in beige siding. Downstairs, I could hear the reassuring sound of Sal's hammer. At least one thing in my life was solid and real. At least someone was building me a place to hide. Weeks crawled by. The FBI stakeout had turned into a monument to boredom. Miller's sighs grew deeper and more frequent. Diaz had started making tiny sculptures out of paper clips. Mrs. Higgins's most suspicious activity had been to switch from oatmeal raisin cookies to snickerdoodles, an event that was debated in hushed tones for an entire afternoon. Down in the basement, however, progress was being made. My sanctuary was taking shape. Sal, true to his word, had framed the room with the Cousin Vinny package, a dense labyrinth of steel studs and thick, sound-dampening insulation. The man was an artist in the medium of drywall and despair. Emboldened by this small victory, I'd decided the bunker needed an upgrade. A soundproofed office was one thing, but a soundproofed office with a wet bar? That was a whole new level of civilized hiding. "You want a wet bar?" Sal had asked, not looking up from his work. "What are you gonna do, get drunk and cry about your life choices in peace?" "Exactly," I'd said. So Sal was in the process of laying the new plumbing. This involved breaking up a small section of the original concrete foundation with a small electric jackhammer. The rhythmic, percussive thump-thump-thump of the jackhammer had become the new soundtrack to my life. It was a sound of progress, a sound of hope. Then the sound changed. Thump-thump-thump-thud. It was a different sound. Not the brittle cracking of old concrete, but a dull, hollow thud. The jackhammering stopped. Silence. "Hey, Al?" Sal's voice echoed up the basement stairs. "You better get down here. Your house has a secret." I hurried down to find Sal on his knees, staring at a jagged hole in the floor. He tapped the edge of the hole with his hammer. Thunk, thunk, it was definitely hollow underneath. A shared look of intrigue passed between us. This was a new development, an unexpected plot twist in the slow, grinding narrative of my life. Together, using a crowbar and a lot of grunting, we pried at the cracked concrete. It came away in large chunks, revealing not dirt and rock, but a layer of rotting plywood. Beneath the plywood was a dark, empty space. We'd found a hidden compartment. My mind went into overdrive. What treasures lay beneath my feet? Was it mob money from the 1970s? Prohibition-era whiskey? The lost manuscript of a famous author? Was it Jimmy Hoffa? "Hand me your phone," Sal grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Need a flashlight." I turned on my phone's light and aimed the beam into the dark cavity. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the hidden contents. For a moment, we just stared, our minds struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated weirdness of what we were seeing. It wasn't gold bars. It wasn't stacks of cash. The compartment was filled with two things. The first was a collection of obsolete computer equipment from the dawn of the Internet age. Bulky, beige-colored zip drives, ancient dial-up modems with their distinctive squawking logos, and a tangle of thick, gray parallel port cables. It was a museum of forgotten technology. The second thing was even stranger. The compartment was packed with dozens and dozens of clear, hard plastic containers, the kind you use to store baseball cards or prized collectibles. And inside each container, nestled on a bed of what looked like cotton wool, was a Beanie Baby. There were hundreds of them, all in pristine mint condition. Each one was sealed in its own protective case, and the iconic heart-shaped tie tag on its ear was itself encased in a secondary, even smaller, hard plastic protector. I recognized them from the collective cultural memory of the 1990s. There was Pinchy the lobster, his little red claws held up in a permanent state of surprise. There was Claude the crab, a tie-dyed monstrosity. There was Peace the bear, with his rainbow fur and embroidered peace sign. It was a king's ransom. If the year was 1998, and the global economy was based on plush toys filled with plastic pellets, Alex and Sal just stared, utterly, completely baffled. My house wasn't built on a secret stash of mob money. It was built on a crypt of forgotten fads. I started to laugh. It began as a small chuckle and grew into a full-blown, tear-streaming, gut-busting laugh. The sheer, sublime absurdity of my life had finally broken me. I was living in a spy thriller directed by a madman, and the central clue, the great hidden secret, was a lobster stuffed with beans. "What's so funny?" Sal grumbled, looking at the pile of plastic-encased toys with disgust. "My sister-in-law had a room full of this junk. Thought she was going to retire on it. Now she uses the seahorse one as a doorstop." "Sal, my friend," I said, wiping a tear from my eye, "this is a work of art. This is the universe telling me a joke." I had to share it. The cosmic punchline was too good to keep to myself. I reached into the crypt and retrieved the container holding Pinchy the lobster. The plastic was cool and smooth in my hand. I headed upstairs, a man possessed by a mission of pure, unadulterated mockery. I found Miller and Diaz in their usual positions, staring out the window with the glazed expressions of men who had memorized every crack in Mrs. Higgins's driveway. Miller was massaging his temples. Diaz was trying to balance a pencil on his upper lip. I strode into the room and held up the lobster with a grand flourish. "Gentlemen," I announced, "breakthrough, I've cracked the case. You can all go home." Miller opened one eye and glared at me. "What are you talking about?" "It's Mrs. Higgins," I explained, my voice filled with mock seriousness. "She's not just a baker of cookies. She's the kingpin of a global underground Beanie Baby cartel. This, I said, waggling the container, is her top enforcer, Pinchy the Claw Lobstano. He's wanted in 7 states for tax evasion and racketeering. He's the one you've been looking for." Miller closed his eye again and let out a sigh so profound it seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. "Go away, Alex." But Diaz? Diaz wasn't sighing. His eyes, which had been glazed over with boredom, were now wide open. They were fixed on the Beanie Baby in my hand with a shocking, laser-like intensity. He wasn't looking at the lobster. He was looking at the tag. He shot up from his chair, his movement so sudden it startled me. He lunged forward and snatched the plastic container from my hand. He held it close to his face, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Miller, look," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Look at the tag protector, the secondary case. It's a Gen 3 polyvinyl, ridged edges, slightly frosted. They only used this specific model for 6 months in late '97. Miller sat up, his interest finally piqued. "So? The old lady's a serious collector, who cares?" Diaz ignored him. He rushed to his briefcase, which was sitting on my guest bed, and snapped it open. He rummaged inside and pulled out a device that looked like a souped-up credit card scanner, all black plastic and blinking lights. He returned to the window, holding Pinchy the lobster with the reverence a priest would show a holy relic. He carefully inserted the edge of the plastic tag protector into a slot on the device. A small red light blinked on the scanner. We all held our breath. The silence in the room was absolute. Then the light turned green, and the device emitted a single, soft beep. Diaz's jaw went slack. He looked from the scanner to Miller, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning excitement. "Holy crap," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's real. Miller, it's really real. The Samler collection. It's here." I just stood there, my joke dead on my lips, holding a handful of nothing. Pinchy the lobster was no longer funny. Pinchy the lobster was now evidence. And I had a terrible, sinking feeling that my basement was about to become a federal crime scene. They sat me down at my own kitchen table. The mood had shifted from one of weary boredom to crackling high-voltage intensity. Miller and Diaz looked at me with new eyes. I was no longer the annoying civilian landlord. I was the guy whose basement contained the holy grail of Cold War espionage. "Alex," Miller began, his voice devoid of its usual grumpiness. It was replaced by a grim seriousness that was far more unsettling. "What we are about to tell you is classified at a level that would make your head spin. When we are done, you will sign a stack of non-disclosure agreements so thick they could be used as a flotation device. Do you understand?" I nodded numbly, my mind still trying to connect the dots between a plush toy and national security. "Mrs. Higgins," Diaz said, leaning forward, "the sweet old lady across the street? Her name isn't Higgins, it's an alias. Her real name is Annalise Schmidt. And for 20 years, she was one of the most effective and elusive assets of the Stasi." "The East German secret police?" I squeaked. "The very same," Miller confirmed. "Her codename was Die Sammlerin. It means the collector. She wasn't an assassin or a spy in the traditional sense. She was a data mule, a librarian of secrets. Her specialty was exfiltrating sensitive information." Diaz took over, his words coming in a rush. During the chaos of the late 80s and early 90s, as the Berlin Wall was falling and Germany was reunifying, the Stasi was in a panic. They had amassed 40 years' worth of secrets, files on every politician, every business leader, every activist. They had blackmail material, lists of active agents in the West, compromising photos, financial records. A digital archive that could destabilize the new Europe. They couldn't let it fall into the hands of the West, so they gave it to D. Samlerin to smuggle out. But how? I asked. How do you smuggle an entire digital archive across international borders? That's the genius of it, Diaz said, a note of professional admiration in his voice. Her accomplice was a man named Klaus Richter, a brilliant but deeply eccentric engineer. He saw the future. He knew that physical files were obsolete. He digitized everything, and then he needed a delivery system, something that could move in plain sight, something no one would ever think to look at twice. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the pieces click into place in my head. The Beanie Baby craze, I whispered, a wave of dawning horror and awe washing over me. It was the perfect cover. Perfect, Miller confirmed with a grim nod. Richter developed a method to encode massive amounts of data onto micro-thin, flexible storage wafers. Wafers so small they were practically invisible. He then developed a process to embed these wafers, suspended in a clear polymer, inside the plastic heart tag protectors. They were shipped to the United States by the thousands, hidden in plain sight amidst legitimate toy shipments. Undetectable, untraceable, the entire Stasi archive hidden in the ears of children's toys. My mind reeled. The absurdity of it was breathtaking. While the world was caught in a speculative frenzy over rare, plush animals, they were inadvertently trading state secrets. We've been hunting for this archive for 30 years, Miller continued. We call it the Samler Collection. We recently got intel that a hostile foreign government had finally located D. Samlerin, the SVR, the new KGB. They were sending a team to retrieve the data. Our mission was to get to it first. He leaned back, the grand reveal almost complete. We were watching her house because we thought the archive was there, but we were wrong. There was one final twist. Klaus Richter, Diaz said softly, the engineer. He was paranoid. He didn't trust Annalise to keep the entire collection in one place. Shortly before he died of a sudden heart attack, he moved the most critical part of the archive, the master index, the key to decrypting the rest of it, to a secondary location for ultimate safekeeping. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of apology and amazement. He was the man who owned your house, Alex. He died a week after he sold it to you. The archive was never in her attic. It's been in your basement this whole time. The silence in my kitchen was so profound I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. My house, my quiet, beige, boring house was ground zero for the final, ridiculous chapter of the Cold War. As this world-shattering, reality-bending information was settling in my brain, a new sound erupted into the room. It was a frantic, squawking voice, tinny and full of panic. It was coming from Agent Diaz's earpiece, an earpiece still tuned to the Harmony Creek neighborhood watch frequency. Brenda, come in! Command post, this is Eagle Eye. We have a situation, I repeat, we have a situation. It was Stan's voice, pitched an octave higher than usual. There are unauthorized landscapers at the Higgins residence. Their van is a commercial vehicle, a clear violation of Bylaw 28F after 5 p.m. And Brenda, their mulch color is maroon. It's not on the approved pallet. Miller and Diaz exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The SVR, they were here, disguised as gardeners. Before either agent could even stand up, we heard it. The sound of a screen door slamming shut, and a voice, shrill with righteous fury, carrying across the street. Excuse me, I'm going to need to see your landscaping permit and your mulch variance application. It was Brenda. Of course, it was Brenda. She was marching across the street, her laminated rulebook held out in front of her like a crucifix to a vampire, ready to do battle with a team of highly trained Russian spies over a breach in horticultural law. She's blowing their cover, Diaz hissed. grabbing a small, tactical-looking pistol from an ankle holster. Miller was already on his feet, speaking urgently into his wrist communicator. "All units, takedown is a go. I repeat, a go. Subject is compromised by a civilian asset." "Civilian asset?" I squeaked. "She's a menace!" The quiet suburban street erupted into chaos. The landscapers dropped their rakes, their faces shifting from confusion to cold professionalism as they realized they'd been made. One of them reached into the back of their maroon, mulch-filled van. Brenda, completely oblivious to the danger, doubled down. "I don't see Harmony Creek sticker on this vehicle. This is a Tier 3 violation." "Stay here," Miller barked at me as he and Diaz burst out of my front door, weapons drawn. I was left standing in my living room, the epicenter of an international incident. In my basement was a treasure trove of secrets that could topple governments. Outside my window, the FBI was about to engage in a firefight with Russian spies, all while being critiqued on their methods by the head of my HOA. Sal appeared at the top of the basement stairs, covered in a fine layer of dust, a confused look on his face. "What's all the yelling? Did the birdwatchers finally see a robin?" I just pointed numbly out the window. The scene was surreal. One of the Russian agents had made a run for it, only to be clotheslined by Mr. Henderson's garden hose, which he was now waving around like a lariat. Brenda was attempting to perform a citizen's arrest on another spy, citing his illegal use of a commercial-grade leaf blower. Diaz was crouched behind my mailbox, while Miller was using Brenda's prized flamingo-shaped bird bath as cover. Sal came and stood next to me, watching the madness unfold. He was silent for a long moment, taking it all in. He turned to me, his expression completely unfazed. "So," he said, scratching his chin, "this gonna affect my invoice? 'Cause I'm definitely charging you extra for hazard pay." The Battle of Harmony Creek, as I later dubbed it, was over in less than 5 minutes. It was swift, efficient, and utterly comical. The highly trained SVR agents, armed with advanced spycraft and years of covert operations experience, were ultimately no match for the confusing, chaotic combination of an FBI takedown team and a furious woman incensed by unapproved mulch. At one point, Brenda, in a fit of pique over her trampled azaleas, actually whacked one of the spies on the back of the head with her binder of bylaws. The man went down like a sack of potatoes, more out of sheer confusion than from the force of the blow. Mrs. Higgins, or Annalise, I guess, surrendered with the quiet, theatrical dignity of a dethroned queen. As 2 agents escorted her to a black sedan, she caught my eye. She paused, gave me a slow, deliberate, and deeply mischievous wink, and then disappeared into the car. The wink seemed to say, "Wasn't that a hoot?" The aftermath was even more surreal. My house was descended upon by a swarm of FBI agents. My basement was cordoned off with yellow tape. The scene was a masterclass in contrasts. Serious-looking men and women in tactical gear and lab coats were tenderly, carefully cataloging and bagging a pile of children's toys. I overheard one agent speak into a radio with grave importance. "We have secured Magic the Dragon. I repeat, Magic is secure. Moving on to Chocolate the Moose." The next day I was summoned to my own kitchen table for a final summit. Miller and Diaz were there, along with their section chief, a stern, impeccably dressed woman named Director Evans, who looked like she ate non-disclosure agreements for breakfast. She slid a stack of papers across the table towards me. It was at least 2 inches thick. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice as crisp as a freshly printed dollar bill, "on behalf of the United States government, I want to thank you for your involuntary civilian assistance." She gestured to the pile of paper. "That is a legally binding, permanent, and non-negotiable non-disclosure agreement. It states that you will not speak, write, tweet, blog, or communicate via interpretive dance anything you have seen or heard in the last several weeks to anyone, ever. Is that clear? I looked at the stack of paper. I looked at the 3 serious faces staring at me. A month ago, I would have signed it without a word. But a month ago, I hadn't had my personal property destroyed, my house invaded, and my basement turned into a vault of Cold War secrets. I was a new man, a man emboldened by absurdity. I pushed the stack of papers back towards her. "Look," I said, my voice steady. "I'll sign it, on one condition. You people owe me. My foundation is cracked. My sense of reality is permanently warped. And your agents," I said, nodding at Miller and Diaz, "drank approximately $80 worth of my single-origin coffee. I think the Department of Justice can spring for some concrete repair and maybe a new espresso machine." Diaz coughed to hide a smile. Miller looked horrified. Director Evans just stared at me, her expression unreadable. For a long, terrifying moment, I thought she was going to have me arrested. Then, the corner of her mouth twitched. A genuine human smile broke through her stern facade. "Throw in a 1-year supply of coffee beans," she said, "and you have a deal." I signed the papers. Of course, you can't have a multi-agency federal takedown on a quiet suburban street without the local police eventually showing up. 2 uniformed officers from the Harmony Creek PD arrived about an hour after the action was over, drawn by the dozen or so calls they'd received about a public disturbance involving a woman yelling about shrubbery. Their names were Officer Mike and Officer Dave, and they were utterly, hopelessly out of their depth. They ambled up to my house, their faces a perfect picture of confusion, and tried to make sense of the scene. "So, what seems to be the problem here?" Officer Mike asked, looking at the FBI agents, the SVR spies sitting in handcuffs on my lawn, and the pile of discarded gardening tools. Director Evans stepped forward and gave them a heavily redacted, jargon-filled explanation about a multi-jurisdictional, interagency training exercise that had encountered unexpected civilian engagement. The cops nodded slowly, clearly understanding none of it, but knowing enough not to ask any more questions. Brenda, however, was not bound by matters of national security. She pulled the 2 officers aside and gave them her own, far more exciting version of events. In her telling, she was the lone hero, the vigilant guardian of the neighborhood. She had spotted a ring of rogue landscapers casing the neighborhood, and using her deep, encyclopedic knowledge of local ordinances and a healthy dose of civic courage, had confronted and subdued them herself, holding them until the Federal Parks Department, as she seemed to think the FBI was, could arrive to assist her. "Their mulch was a clear violation," she concluded, her voice ringing with triumph. "That's how I knew they were up to no good." Officer Mike and Officer Dave just stared at her, then back at the spies, then at the FBI. Finally, Officer Dave just shrugged. "All right, well, try to keep the noise down," he said. And they got back in their patrol car and drove away, no doubt heading straight back to the station to file the most confusing report of their careers. Brenda became a local legend. The Harmony Creek Weekly Gazette ran a front-page story with the headline, "Local HOA President Thwarts Unlicensed Contractor Ring." She had the article professionally framed and hung it in the community clubhouse. Her authority in Harmony Creek was now absolute, her power cemented by her fictional act of heroism. In a strange way, I was almost happy for her. A month later, a new kind of quiet had settled over 112 Snapdragon Lane. It wasn't the sterile, boring quiet I had originally sought. It was a richer silence, one filled with the echoes of absurdity and the knowledge that the world was infinitely stranger than I had ever imagined. Sal had finished the basement. It was magnificent. The Cousin Vinny soundproofing was so effective that when the door was closed, the outside world simply ceased to exist. It was no longer just a man cave. It was my bunker, my fortress, my testament to surviving a very weird month. And, true to her word, Director Evans had come through. The wet bar was fully stocked, and sitting proudly on the counter was a gleaming, chrome, semi-professional espresso machine, paid for by a line item in the federal budget probably labeled Suburban Tranquility Preservation Grant. Sal and I were now firm friends, bonded by our shared, state-sanctioned secret. We'd have beers down there sometimes, and he'd just shake his head and mutter, "Bird watchers. I'm telling my grandkids about this one." My relationship with Brenda had also changed. We'd reached a sort of grudging truce. She now saw me not as a rogue element, but as a fellow soldier who had been in the trenches with her during the great mulch war of Snapdragon Lane. She even granted me an official, notarized variance for 1-1 approved electronic surveillance device, for which I had to submit a 12-page application detailing the camera's make, model, resolution, and its potential impact on the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. I installed a single camera pointing directly at my front porch. It felt like enough. I was in my new man cave, sitting on a comfortable leather couch, on a video call with my parents. "So, things are good?" my mom asked. "It's quiet? You're happy?" "Oh yeah," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "It's been an adventure. You wouldn't believe the people I've met." After the call, I went to check the mail. Tucked between a Pottery Barn catalog and a water bill was a small, square package, a cardboard box with no return address. My heart gave a little thump. I took it back down to my bunker and carefully opened it. Inside, nestled in a bed of bubble wrap, was a single beanie baby. It was an elephant, a deep royal blue color. I recognized it instantly from my panicked late-night Googling. It was Peanut, one of the rarest and most sought-after beanie babies in existence. Taped to the plastic case was a small, stiff card, the kind that felt official. On it, written in neat block letters, was a short message. "A souvenir for your trouble. We checked this one, it's clean. Probably. D." I held the elephant in my hand, the weight of its absurdity feeling strangely comforting. I looked around my basement fortress, at my ridiculously expensive espresso machine, at my soundproofed walls. Then, my eyes drifted to the corner of the room where I'd mounted a small monitor displaying a live feed from my new HOA-approved security camera. A slow, sarcastic grin spread across my face. I walked over to the monitor, directly into the camera's line of sight. I held up the royal blue elephant, presenting it to the lens like a trophy. "You know what?" I said, speaking to the camera and to the quiet, listening world beyond it. "I think I'm going to take up bird watching. You never know what you might see." I set the elephant down on the bar, a priceless, ridiculous memento from my short, strange, and entirely involuntary career in international espionage. The new normal had begun, and it was anything but quiet.